Alright, today I've got a story to tell you guys, and this comes from back in the glory days. Back in the good old days, I worked for the United States Foreign Service as a diplomat. And yes, that means I had one of these black passports. Anyway, among other things, my job meant that I had to frequently take foreign language tests through the Foreign Service Institute. One day, a little over a decade ago, I had a Chinese test scheduled over a teleconference line while I was working at the US Embassy in Ottawa, Canada. Now, things have changed in the Foreign Service world since then, definitely, and also in the Foreign Service Institute world. So back then, part of this language test involved reading like a few long passages from, I don't know, like fiction or something like that in Chinese. As I recall, like there was also some like philosophy stuff or something like that. After you'd read this, the testers would have you talk with them about it in English. Yes, so you had to be able to go from one language to the next and on the fly. And we're talking about really abstract stuff too, right? This isn't like reading the menu at the restaurant. Don't ask me what that has to do with your ability to, process visas or whatever your job was. Anyway, they gave me something really difficult to read that was taken completely out of context, something that looked kind of like this. I did the best that I could in the test, though I honestly don't remember what the text was even about. Now, usually they will wait a while to give you your score, but for some reason they gave my score to me right away. Anyway, FSI uses a 1 to 5 scale, or I guess 0 to 5 technically, and it's been like that since the dawn of the Cold War. Anyway, when I took this test, they gave me a 3+ in speaking and a 3+ in reading. And even though it was technically against the rules, they took some time and gave me some pointers on how to improve my score. The advice they gave me was to find some retired literature professors from like Beijing University or some other highly literate native speakers to talk with. Now, of course, I had been out of school for about a decade by this time. I was living and working in Canada, and I didn't exactly have a Rolodex full of literature professor email addresses and phone numbers. But according to these teachers, the best way to get into the realm of advanced Chinese language skills was to find some professors and chat with them about stuff. Yeah, that's not exactly the most practical advice in the world. So you see, the old-style FSI language test was inherently unfair. You never knew what the reading portion was going to contain, and because of that, it was almost impossible to prepare for it. It could have been from any possible Chinese literature from the last, 5,000 years. Now, I learned later, after talking with some of these testers in a different setting, that they really judged your reading ability based on whether your interpretation of the text matched whatever the standard interpretation was. That meant that the only way to legitimately get a high score, at least on the reading portion, was to become familiar with as many pieces of Chinese literature as humanly possible. So maybe it's a good thing that the test has changed. Now, it is true that reading a lot of Chinese text will help your language skills. However, there's a lot more to being an advanced student of the language than just reading. Actually, if you approach learning the language with the right mindset, you can set yourself up for success as an advanced student right from the beginning. Anyway, I'm going to give you a couple of tips on how to actually become an advanced speaker of Chinese, or of any foreign language for that matter. This is the advice that the teachers that I had as part of that test at FSI probably should have told me back in those days. Now, as you'll see in a second, you can do all of these right from the beginner stage. Like the first day you learn this language, whatever language it is, you can start doing these steps. And if you get this set up right, the transition from beginner to advanced learner of the language will be a lot faster. It won't be that hard for you to go from a beginning level to a very, very high level. In other words, if you want to be, cool like me and start reading Dream of the Red Chamber in the original Chinese, I would recommend following some of these steps. My first piece of advice is to talk with normal people. Okay, so maybe you're not going to have a deep heart-to-heart talk with them in a scenic part of rural Tieling. The thing is, though, that the best way to get a grasp on any language is to talk with ordinary people. Or in other words, talking with a bunch of former professors is really not going to help you. Of course, you might get, literary insights from them or whatever, but the thing is, if you're really trying to master the target language and have it so that it's living in your head, you've got to go talk with normal people, not just a whole bunch of, highfalutin educated folk. One of the things I've learned after living in numerous countries and talking with a lot of people is that we all really have a lot in common. And of course, the very best way to get to know how somebody really thinks and feels is to learn how to speak their language and then speak with them in that language. The most impressive academic resume in the world is not going to mean much if you don't know how to carry on a normal conversation with an ordinary person. And to really be an advanced language student, you have to open yourself up to various dialects. Now, I figured when I was living there that living in Northeast China would be worthless if I didn't learn at least some of the Dongbei. That's the sort of thing that you really need to start paying attention to, especially if you want to advance from the status of being a stranger in a foreign land to somebody who is truly immersed in the local culture. Now, when it comes to reading Dream of the Red Chamber, knowing dialects will help you more than you think. In particular, Granny Liu speaks with an unmistakable Northeastern Chinese dialect, and it actually matches the modern Northeastern dialect quite well. While you can still understand a lot of the book if you're not all that well versed in colloquial Chinese, the more of the colloquial language you know, the better off you are. Plus, of course, it is a lot easier to learn the language when you treat the language as a living thing. Languages are the way that human beings communicate with other human beings. Now, books are great, right? They help preserve thoughts, logical patterns, things like that over generations. But nothing in the world of language learning is quite like actually speaking with a native speaker of the language. That brings me straight to my second point, which is very controversial. My second piece of advice is that you really need to learn how to write in the target language. The best way to do this is to write by hand, and you can find books like this to help you when you're at the beginning stages of learning Chinese. Once you get to a more advanced stage and know the stroke order by heart, you can start just practicing character writing on your own without having that character guide in front of you. And believe it or not, kids who learn Chinese like native speakers will also use paper like this to practice learning how to write their own language. So I know that there is this huge debate out there among learners of Chinese as a second language, not just people from English-speaking countries, but people from everywhere, about whether learning how to write is actually worth it. There are a lot of you who are convinced that learning how to write makes no difference, and so you might as well not do it, right? I know that you're there because you write comments on my videos all the time. Well, I'm here to tell you that you are wrong. You need to learn how to write if you want to learn how to read the language at an advanced level. There is no shortcut. In fact, if you refuse to learn how to write, you will eventually discover that your language learning will plateau. It'll be throttled. And once you start learning how to write after you've advanced everything up to whatever level you get to, you're going to find that it's really, really hard to catch up. You need to learn this from the very beginning stages. Look, when you're dealing with a book filled with complex poetry and difficult literary allusions, you really need to know your characters. Having a vague idea of what one character might stand for is not going to cut it. And the best way to learn how to differentiate the characters is to practice writing them out over and over again. So, doing all that practice, sitting down and writing, spending some time every day doing it helps a lot. Why? It helps because this helps you internalize the characters. You cannot internalize characters in Chinese or Japanese or whatever if you're only glancing at them once in a while every now and then. Now, I know that some people have been upset with me for not citing, academic studies on the subject. It's because they don't exist, right? I'm telling you here what's worked for me and also what works for native speakers of the language, because this is what they do when they go to school. They learn how to write characters. You have to learn how to write. In large part, you have to learn how to write because learning how to write is how you learn how to read. The third thing is to read stuff that you actually want to read. Now, there are tons and tons of different Chinese books that you can read. There are tons of different texts and books and articles that you could read, ranging from modern fiction to ancient philosophical texts. Now, the truth is that it does not matter what you read. So you've got a thing for Wikipedia articles about Chinese basketball, go read that. If you got a thing for erotic literature, go read that, right? It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you have to follow two general rules. Now, the first rule is that you need to read something that you actually care about. As nice as things like comprehensive grammar books are, it's probably not going to hold your interest for long. And even though you can get advanced textbooks, you really need to move beyond stuff like this. In particular, official newspaper articles and carefully curated stories in these textbooks are going to make you go nuts after a little while. Sure, if you read a normal book, you won't have something like this convenient list of new words, but with resources like Wiktionary out there, you've really got no excuse for sticking with boring textbooks. Why do you have to read stuff that you actually care about? Well, this is simple. If you read something you care about, you're going to be excited to go read, right? You'll want to do your language study. If you're just reading like some stuff you don't care about at all that doesn't mean anything to you, it's going to be a real drag because it takes time. And instead of like reading this, you'd rather be, I don't know, like watching an NBA game or something like that. Anyway, the second general rule is related to it. You need to broaden your interests. One of the reasons I've always liked literary compilation magazines like Duja is because you get a good variety of different styles. The more variety you read, the more that your literary world will expand, and that will make the Chinese language even more interesting to you. About 20 years ago, my introduction to Chinese literature came through this literary anthology. This was part of a language class that I took when I was at Nanjing University. I remember that the short story Kuangren Ruji, or Diary of a Madman, was my first exposure to modern Chinese literature, and this is what got me to fall in love with it. Now, you're probably not going to naturally fall in love with like some work of fiction that's mostly unknown in your native country, whichever it is. So since you're dealing with a foreign language like Chinese, you really have to do some of the legwork to figure out where the good stuff is. That's why it's important not just to read things that you're familiar with, though you should do that, but you should also spend at least some time reading stuff that you're not familiar with. And this is where literary anthologies will help, or like literary magazines, stuff like that. You never know what you might find. Anyway, on to point number 4. All right, I know that I sound like a broken record on this point, but number 4 is once again that you really need to relax and watch some TV. The thing is that television watching is a great way to advance your spoken Chinese skills. This is also great for passive learning, even if you've got the subtitles on. So there are some people who have written in the comments to my videos and also on Reddit and other places about how they really wish that they had more comprehensible input at whatever level that they're at. So I'll give you my advice once I figured out what you mean by comprehensible input. My advice for this is that you need to stop worrying about something that meets your level exactly. Instead, you need to go find native speaker like TV shows and movies and just watch them. Pay attention to how people say things. If you don't understand it, it's fine. If you need to use subtitles, go ahead and use them. But you need to hear those patterns of speech. You need to hear the rhythms. You need to understand like where the emphasis is, right? Where it is that they're hesitating if they don't know what to say, or they're halfway through the sentence, don't know how to finish it. What kind of words are they adding in? Make sure, though, above all else, that you spend some time watching at least something. The thing is that native speakers have a certain rhythm and cadence to how they speak. To become a successful advanced student of the language, you really need to understand that cadence and rhythm. The best way to understand this is by constantly exposing yourself to the language in an authentic setting. This might seem weird, but there was this post on the language learning subreddit a few months ago that describes precisely what I'm talking about. The thing that this poster calls prosody, the rhythm and melody of a language, is actually much more important than the individual sounds, or in Chinese, the tones. Now, the best way to figure out the prosody of any given language is to spend a heck of a lot of time just listening to it and getting a feel for its rhythm and melody. And of course, you also need feedback from a native speaker, which again was my first piece of advice. Now, you really don't need to get feedback from like a stuffy professor who's going to want to talk about literary theory and stuff like that all day long. Now, the feedback that you really need to get here is the feedback that comes from like the waitress at the restaurant who doesn't understand a word that you just said, or the flight attendant who's like absolutely surprised that you spoke to her in her native language and she doesn't know what to do, or from your wife when she laughs at you when you try to say something to her in her native dialect, right? The secret to figuring this part out is watching a lot of television and a lot of movies. Right? I know that many of you are like me, right? I grew up learning that the right way to learn stuff is to read a lot of books, and that people who just watch TV all day were kind of stupid. The truth is that books cannot talk to you. You have to watch TV. Anyway, all of this comes together with tip number 5. All right, tip number 5 is to use Anki, or a similar spatial memorization program. In particular, I recommend making your own cards and decks instead of downloading some things that somebody else made. When you've got your own cards set up, adding new cards is as simple as just making a spreadsheet while you do your normal study. It's extremely easy to upload these spreadsheets into Anki once everything is set up. And since this is your deck, you can find your own audio files, or you can use something like HyperTTS to just generate them yourself. Now, the reason why I'm telling you to create your own Anki deck and not just download it or pay money to somebody for a deck is because you need to have that ability to customize it for yourself. right? And I'm not just talking about like, oh, you need to put in the words that you just learned or that you're studying or whatever. No, I'm talking about customizing it for your own learning style or for topics that you're interested in or for like the voices you want to hear, stuff like that, right? You need to have a lot of control over this because it needs to be yours. As the years have gone by, I've taught myself how to do a bunch of things to improve my Anki experience, such as ways to improve the audio files that you'll find on sites like Forvo. I've also learned how to arrange cards to force myself to type in whatever my target language happens to be. It's not as difficult as you think to put this sort of thing together, and this can be extraordinarily powerful and very helpful to your language study. Now the thing is that typing is not quite as good as writing by hand, but it is helpful, especially for languages that use letters. You know, like I just showed you, like what, Swedish, right? Like, I guess I could take a piece of paper and sit down and write Swedish words out over and over and over again, but it's not that much different from actually typing them, right? It's not like these character-based languages where the shape of the character is very important, and that's the thing that you need to internalize. Anyway, so there you have it. There are my 5 tips, right? To get to the advanced level, you don't need to go talk with a retired professor about like literature or anything like that. No, you just need to talk with normal people. You need to learn how to write. You need to read stuff that you care about, like not just the textbook, right? Something that you actually want to read. You need to kick back and watch some TV. And then finally, you need to let Anki help sort your brain out. Now, if you start all of this stuff at the beginning of your language learning journey, you will find that it is a lot easier and faster to get to the advanced level than you thought at first. And while you're working on all this stuff and you're like, I need to have something to, get my Chinese learning brain going, head on over to my blog and let's read some Dream of the Red Chamber together. Talk to you next time.